Hi everybody, welcome back. In this video, I'll be solving another SQL problem. Problem number 550, gameplay analysis. Let's take a look at the problem statement. We're given a table called activity. This table has 4 columns: player ID, device ID, event date, and games played. The combination of 2 columns, player ID and device ID, is the primary key of this table. This table shows the activity of players of some games. Each row is a record of a player who logged in and played a number of games, possibly 0, before logging out on some day using some device. Our task is to report the fraction of players that logged in again on the day after the day they first logged in, rounded to 2 decimal places. In other words, you need to count the number of players that logged in for at least 2 consecutive days starting from their first login date, then divided that number by the total number of players. So let's take a note of that. We need to count the number of players that logged in for at least 2 consecutive days starting from their first login date. I'm gonna copy this over. So at least 2 consecutive days starting from the first login date, not the second or any other day, right? So we have to find the first login date. This is similar to the last problem that I solved. Next, so we get the count of that players that meet the requirement. We divide that number by the total number of players. So this is our formula here to get the fraction. So the fraction is defined as the count of the player ID meeting this requirement, right? Play at least 2 consecutive days. Right, we divide it by count of total number of players, total number of players, right? Let's take a look at the example. So in the activity table, there are player IDs number 1, 2, and 3. Player ID number 1 has 2 event dates and they are consecutive on the first and the second. This player logged in on the next day, so that is 2 consecutive days. Player number 2 logged in once. Player number 3 logged in twice, but they are not consecutive. And the output is, so only 1 played consecutively, so that's 1 over the total number of players, that is 3. And the fraction is going to be 0.33. Alright, so how do we solve this problem? There are a couple of ways to solve this problem, and note that for days that are more than 2 days consecutive, we only count once. So the approach I'm taking is, first I'm going to, let's first get the first date, value. First date value, and I'm going to use the first value function. Right, we can use row number rank or dense rank, but in this case I'm gonna use first value, and then I will use lead function to get the consecutive days. So use lead function, right, to check the consecutive days or not, to get the consecutive days. So lead function, in my past videos I use lag function to get the previous row. In this case I'm going to use lead function because I want to compare the current date here, the current event date, with the one next to it. So the syntax is gonna be lead, and the column of, and this is the column of the event date that I want to compare. So it's gonna be event date, and the offset is 1. over, we're going to partition by player ID over event date, right? Over event date. So this is to check the consecutive days. So in order to check consecutive days in my query, I will compare and make sure that the next day is equal to the current date at 1 day. So there's a function for that. It's called date add, and it's going to be event date with the interval of 1 day. So after getting these two columns, like first value, check to make sure this is the first value and the consecutive days, I will create a CTE for this data, right? I will create a CTE to store data with the appended next date column and the first date column. For the new temp table, temporary table that has next day and first date column. Lastly, I will apply the formula up here to get the fraction, right? To get the fraction, this formula. Right, so let's solve this problem. Right, so let's first create these two columns to get the first date value and the next date value. So in order to do that, we do select star. We're gonna get the next day column by using lead function. So lead event date over partition by player ID, and we order by event date. All right, and we call this column next day, because after that I will compare to make sure that for one player, if there are two login dates, they have to be consecutive, and we'll make sure that it's the consecutive dates or not. And then we create another column called first date by using first value function, event date over partition by player ID, and we also order by event date. And we call this column first date. All right. Okay, so we're gonna select all of those from activity. All right, let's run this first and take a look at the output. All right, so for player ID number 1, we have the event date, and this is the current date, right? And next day is this date. So and the first date is also this date. And for player ID number 2, we don't have next day because this player only logged in once, and the first date is also this date. For player ID number 3, the next date is this one, and the first date is this. So in this case, this is why we need to create another next day, because then I will compare these two values together, and I use the date add function. If the next day is not equal to this event date plus 1, then they are not consecutive. All right, nice. So what is next? So I will create a CTE. So yes, so let's create a CTE for this data. So I will call this with data as. You can name the CTE table whatever you like. So sometimes it's hard to name tables, so I just put data, but you can name it whatever you like. I'm gonna select star first and take a look. Select star from data So here, so we only care about if the event date is the first day or not. So I'm gonna do where event, this is our condition, event date has to be equal to first date, right? So event date has to be equal to first date. So we only calculate the we count the first date only, from the first date only. And this is where I compare if the days are consecutive. So and next day, right, equal to, so as I said earlier, I'm gonna use date add function. Date add is gonna be event date plus 1. So it's the next day. Interval 1 day. All right, so let's run this real quick and see what the output looks like. So as you can see, there's only one player ID that played 2 days consecutively, counting from the first date. All right, so our last task is to calculate the fraction. So to calculate the fraction, we can apply this formula here. So it's gonna be, we don't need any other column, we need the fraction column only. So it's gonna be count player ID divided by all the player ID from activity table. I'm gonna do select count, I'm gonna do distinct player ID because there's duplicate rows for player ID, so we only want the distinct. So it's gonna be 1, 2, 3, count distinct player ID from activity. Okay, and we call this fraction. But we also need to round the fraction to 2 decimal places. So I'm gonna do round to. Okay, so let's run this. All right, so I have the fraction of 0.33 as we calculated earlier. Is 1 divided by 3 is 0.33. So let's submit this one. Let's see if we're running into any edge cases. All right, so runtime 1244 millisecond beats 18.17% of users with MySQL. All right, that is it for today. Thank you for watching, and I see you in another video.